The DNA of the Nephilim. Why did God want to erase this race from the earth? The Bible contains many mysterious passages that have puzzled scholars, theologians, and curious readers for thousands of years. Among the most intriguing and controversial are the brief mentions of beings called the Nephilim. These enigmatic figures appear in just a few verses, yet they have sparked countless debates, theories, and interpretations about their true nature and the role they played in ancient biblical history. Who were these mysterious beings? Why does the Bible suggest that God wanted them completely eliminated from the earth? And what can we understand about their supposed DNA, or genetic makeup, from the ancient texts? These questions touch on some of the most profound mysteries in biblical literature, involving divine beings, human corruption, and divine judgment. The biblical foundation. Where do we find the Nephilim? The Nephilim are mentioned primarily in two key passages in the Old Testament. The first and most detailed account appears in Genesis 6:1-4, just before the story of Noah's flood. The second, briefer mention occurs in Numbers 13:33, when the Israelite spies report on the inhabitants of the Promised Land. Genesis 6:1-4 provides the foundational narrative. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. This passage raises immediate questions. Who are the sons of God? What exactly were the Nephilim? And why does this brief account seem to trigger God's decision to flood the earth? The second mention in Numbers 13:33 comes from the spies' fearful report about the inhabitants of Canaan. We saw the Nephilim. There, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. This suggests that beings similar to or descended from the pre-flood Nephilim were still present in the land centuries later. Interpretations through history. Three major theories. Throughout history, biblical scholars and theologians have proposed three main interpretations of who the Nephilim were and what their origins might have been. The angelic interpretation. The most ancient and perhaps most dramatic interpretation suggests that the sons of God were fallen angels or divine beings who descended to earth and had relations with human women. This view was widely held in early Jewish literature, including the Book of Enoch, though not part of the biblical canon, and by many early Christian church fathers. According to this interpretation, these divine beings violated the natural order by crossing the boundary between the heavenly and earthly realms. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were hybrid beings, part divine, part human, possessing supernatural size, strength, and abilities that made them formidable and potentially dangerous. The appeal of this interpretation lies in its explanation of why God would be so concerned about these beings. If the Nephilim represented a corruption of human DNA through supernatural intervention, they could pose a threat to God's plan for humanity. Their very existence might represent a contamination of the human race that required divine intervention to correct. Early Jewish texts like Warren Enoch elaborate extensively on this theme, describing how these fallen angels, called Watchers, taught humans forbidden knowledge, including warfare, cosmetics, and various arts and sciences. The corruption wasn't just genetic, but cultural and spiritual as well. The Sethite interpretation, a second major interpretation, favored by many traditional Christian theologians, suggests that the sons of God refers to the lineage of Seth, Adam's righteous son, while the daughters of men refers to the descendants of Cain, the murderer. According to this view, the problem wasn't supernatural beings intermarrying with humans, but rather the mixing of the righteous and unrighteous human lineages. In this interpretation, the Nephilim weren't necessarily supernatural hybrids, but rather powerful, violent men who emerged from this mixing of the godly and ungodly lines. The term Nephilim itself comes from a Hebrew root meaning to fall, which could refer to fallen humans rather than fallen angels. This interpretation has the advantage of avoiding some of the more fantastic elements of the angelic theory, while still explaining the moral corruption that led to the flood. It suggests that the problem was spiritual and moral rather than genetic, and that God's judgment was about human wickedness rather than supernatural contamination. The tyrannical ruler's interpretation. A third interpretation suggests that the sons of God were human rulers or kings who claimed divine authority and took women by force. In this view, the Nephilim were the violent offspring of these tyrannical leaders, known for their oppression and brutality. This interpretation focuses on the abuse of power and the violation of women's rights as the core issue that prompted divine judgment. The heroes of old, men of renown mentioned in Genesis 6:4, are seen not as admirable figures, but as notorious tyrants whose reputations were built on violence and oppression. The DNA question: what made the Nephilim different? When we speak of the DNA of the Nephilim, we're using modern genetic terminology to explore an ancient mystery. The biblical text doesn't provide scientific details about genetics, but it does suggest that something about these beings was fundamentally different from ordinary humans. The key clues come from the descriptions of their physical and moral characteristics. They are described as giants. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, suggesting unusual size and strength. They are associated with violence and corruption, implying behavioral traits that set them apart from normal human society. If we accept the angelic interpretation, the DNA difference would be supernatural, a literal mixing of divine and human nature that produced beings with capabilities beyond normal human limits. This could explain their reported gigantic size and their association with violence and moral corruption. From a theological perspective, this mixing might represent more than just physical differences. It could symbolize a fundamental corruption of human nature itself, a contamination that threatened God's plan for humanity and required drastic intervention to prevent its spread. However, it's important to note that the biblical text itself doesn't provide detailed genetic or biological explanations. The focus is primarily on the moral and spiritual implications rather than the physical mechanisms involved. The connection to divine judgment. The timing of the Nephilim account in Genesis 6 is significant. It appears immediately before God's decision to flood the earth. This placement suggests a direct connection between the existence of these beings and the divine judgment that followed. Genesis 6:5-7 states, "The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them." The question is whether the Nephilim were simply part of the general human corruption, or whether they represented something special that required divine intervention. If they were indeed the offspring of supernatural beings and humans, their very existence might have threatened the integrity of the human race itself. From this perspective, the flood wasn't just punishment for moral corruption, but a necessary act to preserve pure human DNA and prevent the complete contamination of the human species. Noah and his family would have been chosen not just for their righteousness, but for their genetic purity, perfect in his generations, as Genesis 6:9 describes Noah in some translations. The survival question: how did giants return after the flood? One of the most puzzling aspects of the Nephilim account is the suggestion in Numbers 13:33 that similar beings existed in Canaan long after the flood. If the flood was meant to eliminate the Nephilim, how did they or their descendants survive? Several theories attempt to address this problem. The "also afterward" theory. Some scholars point to the phrase "and also afterward" in Genesis 6:4 as suggesting that the mixing of sons of God and daughters of men continued even after the flood. In this interpretation, the flood eliminated the existing Nephilim but didn't prevent the same supernatural processes from occurring again later. The incomplete destruction theory. Another possibility is that the flood, while covering the earth, didn't completely eliminate all the Nephilim or their descendants. Perhaps some survived in areas not reached by the flood, or perhaps some of Noah's descendants carried the necessary genetic material to produce giant offspring again. The metaphorical interpretation. Some scholars suggest that the Numbers 13:33 reference is metaphorical or exaggerated, reflecting the spies' fear rather than literal truth about giant descendants. The comparison to grasshoppers might be hyperbole intended to emphasize their terror, rather than accurate reporting about supernatural beings. The different giants theory. A fourth possibility is that the post-flood giants were not actually Nephilim in the technical sense, but were simply large, powerful people who reminded the Israelites of the legendary pre-flood beings. The spies might have used Nephilim as a general term for any intimidating group of people. Archaeological and historical perspectives. While the biblical account provides the primary source for information about the Nephilim, various archaeological discoveries and historical records from other ancient cultures have been cited by some researchers as potential evidence for the existence of unusually large ancient peoples. Ancient Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek cultures all contain stories of giants or hybrid beings born from the union of gods and humans. The Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, describes its hero as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. Greek mythology is filled with stories of titans and heroes born from divine human unions. Some researchers point to archaeological discoveries of unusually large skeletal remains as potential evidence for ancient giant races. However, these claims remain highly controversial within mainstream archaeology, with most scientists attributing such findings to normal human variation, measurement errors, or hoaxes. The ancient historian Josephus wrote about the Nephilim, describing them as giants whose bodies were so large and whose faces were so different from ordinary humans that seeing them was amazing and terrifying. He claimed that their bones were still being discovered in his time. Theological implications. Why would God want to eliminate them? The question of why God would want to completely eliminate the Nephilim touches on fundamental questions about divine justice, human nature, and God's plan for creation. The corruption of creation theory. If the Nephilim represented a supernatural corruption of human nature, their elimination could be seen as necessary to preserve the integrity of God's creation. Just as a gardener might remove diseased plants to prevent infection from spreading, God might have acted to prevent the complete corruption of humanity. This interpretation suggests that the flood was not arbitrary punishment, but a form of divine surgery, removing corrupted elements to preserve the healthy whole. The Nephilim, in this view, represented an existential threat to human nature itself. The violence and oppression theory. Another theological perspective focuses on the Nephilim's association with violence and oppression. If these beings were using their supernatural size and strength to terrorize and dominate ordinary humans, their elimination would represent divine justice for the innocent and vulnerable. This interpretation emphasizes God's role as protector of the weak and oppressed. The judgment on the Nephilim becomes an act of liberation rather than arbitrary destruction. The redemption plan theory. Some theologians suggest that the elimination of the Nephilim was necessary to preserve God's plan for human redemption. If humanity was to be saved through the coming of a human Messiah, the preservation of pure human nature was essential. The Nephilim, as hybrid beings, might have represented a threat to this redemptive plan. Modern interpretations and applications. In contemporary times, the story of the Nephilim has been interpreted through various lenses, from science fiction to conspiracy theories to serious theological study. Literary and cultural impact. The Nephilim have captured the imagination of countless writers, filmmakers, and artists. They appear in fantasy novels, science fiction stories, and horror films as mysterious ancient beings with superhuman abilities. This cultural fascination reflects the enduring power of the biblical mystery. Scientific perspectives. Some modern readers attempt to interpret the Nephilim account through the lens of contemporary genetics and evolutionary biology. While such interpretations are speculative, they reflect humanity's ongoing desire to understand ancient mysteries through modern knowledge. Theological reflection. Contemporary theologians continue to wrestle with the implications of the Nephilim account for understanding God's nature and humanity's relationship with the divine. Questions about divine judgment, human nature, and the problem of evil all intersect in this ancient story. The broader context, violence and corruption in ancient times. To understand the Nephilim account fully, it's important to place it within the broader context of the biblical narrative about human corruption and divine response to evil. The early chapters of Genesis paint a picture of escalating human violence and moral decay. From Cain's murder of Abel to Lamech's boastful violence, humanity appears to be spiraling toward complete moral collapse. The Nephilim account fits within this broader pattern of corruption. Whether interpreted as supernatural beings, tyrannical rulers, or the violent offspring of mixed marriages, the Nephilim represent the culmination of human corruption. They embody the complete breakdown of moral order that makes divine judgment necessary. Lessons and questions for modern readers. The story of the Nephilim, regardless of how we interpret the specific details, raises important questions that remain relevant today. Questions about power and responsibility. If the Nephilim were indeed beings of supernatural strength and ability, their story raises questions about how power should be used and what happens when it's abused. Whether ancient or modern, those with exceptional abilities bear special responsibility for how they use their gifts. Questions about human nature. The account challenges us to think about what makes us fundamentally human and what might threaten or corrupt human nature. While we may not face the specific challenges described in Genesis 6, we do face questions about genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, and other technologies that could potentially alter human nature. Questions about divine justice. The harsh judgment described in the flood narrative raises difficult questions about divine justice and mercy. How do we understand a God who would eliminate entire populations? What does this teach us about the seriousness of moral corruption and the importance of righteousness? Questions about fear and faith. The Israelite spies' fearful response to the giants in Canaan reminds us of how fear can paralyze us and prevent us from trusting in divine promises. Their exaggerated report led to 40 years of wilderness wandering, showing the real consequences of allowing fear to overcome faith. Conclusion. The enduring mystery. The mystery of the Nephilim continues to fascinate readers thousands of years after the ancient texts were written. Whether we interpret them as supernatural beings, tyrannical rulers, or simply as symbols of human corruption, they represent something important about the human condition and our relationship with the divine. The question of their DNA, whether literal genetics or metaphorical nature, touches on fundamental issues about what makes us human and what threatens our humanity. The account of their elimination raises profound questions about divine justice and the price of moral corruption. Perhaps the enduring appeal of the Nephilim story lies not in any definitive answers it provides, but in the important questions it raises. In a world still grappling with issues of power, corruption, violence, and the proper limits of human ambition, the ancient account remains surprisingly relevant. The biblical text itself provides only tantalizing glimpses of these mysterious beings, leaving much to interpretation and speculation. This ambiguity may be intentional, inviting readers to wrestle with the deeper theological and moral issues rather than getting lost in the details of ancient genetics or supernatural biology. Whatever the Nephilim were, their story serves as a warning about the consequences of corruption and the importance of maintaining moral boundaries. It reminds us that actions have consequences, that power brings responsibility, and that some lines should not be crossed. In our modern age, as we face our own questions about the limits of human achievement and the proper boundaries of scientific and technological progress, the ancient story of the Nephilim continues to offer relevant insights. It challenges us to consider not just what we can do, but what we should do, and to remember that true greatness is measured not by power or size, but by righteousness and faithfulness to divine purpose. The mystery of the Nephilim may never be fully solved, but their story continues to teach, challenge, and inspire readers to think deeply about the most fundamental questions of human existence and our relationship with the divine.